Welcome everyone to today's Tuesday talk. Thank you all for being here. Today's talk will be presented by Kari Ronning. The subject will be Eyes on the Center, looking at how quilt makers have focused attention to the center of their quilts from the 18th century through to the early 20th century. Kari has been a student of quilt patterns and quilt history for a long time and also a quilter. She made many of the quilts that are on display today, and she has also written and co-written several chapters of the Nebraska Quilts and Quiltmakers Project, and she was a past president of the Lincoln Quilters Guild and has served in other offices in the guild as well. And she recently retired from the UNL English department, where she's the editor of the Willa Cather Scholarly Edition. Thank you for being here, Kari. Everyone, please.
Thank you, Lauren. I got this at a good volume. Well, it's always a pleasure to come to the Quilt Museum and to be part of the quilt making world. Today I want to show you some quilts I made to give myself the pleasure of participating in American quilt history. With one exception, the quilts that I'm going to show you today are ones that I made usually after I fell in love with a picture in a book or somebody else's quilt. I love old things, and particularly old quilts, so my original goal in this project was to make one quilt to represent each decade, say from 1850 to 1950. Well, I soon realized that that wasn't going to work. There, 10 quilts, that doesn't cover American quilt history. So more than 100 quilts later, I know there are still so many styles and designs and ideas in quilting that I'm never going to get to them all, but even though I do small ones. The reason why I do small quilts, I have made bed-sized quilts, but the one big problem is the quilting. I don't consider myself a quilter. I'm a piecer, as some of you are, I know. But I'm not a good quilter. I was never able to teach myself to quilt on a frame or even a hoop, and possibly that was because I never learned to use a thimble when I sewed. My grandmother, who trained as a professional dressmaker, said you can never be a good sewer if you don't use a thimble. But I will note that my grandmother was always liked to be in style. In the early 20s, she was going to be in style and make a quilt with her sister. And so, they were all excited about it. And as soon as they finished their chores, they would get together and they would quilt on it. And they were so excited when it was finally time to take the quilt out of the frame, and they turned it over. And my grandmother was aghast at how irregular and large the stitches were on the back, and she never made another quilt. She did appreciate quilts. She would buy quilts from others, when she could afford it, but her standards were too high. I guess that's the best is the enemy of the good, and I'll stay with the good, I hope. So, anyhow, I made small quilts to get them done, and the size was more or less decided by the dowel bed that I bought for my daughter, who's here today. It's under here. As you can see, the doll bed never got a mattress, but it has a Princess and the Pea-sized stack of quilts to go on it. And I also chose this size because it was large enough that I didn't have to get into the whole miniature itty-bitty teeny tiny pieces thing. So So after I abandoned the one quilt per decade idea, I just kind of proceeded as I looked at quilts. I didn't have any particular plan. But I'm not particularly fond of crazy quilts, so you won't see very many examples of that at all. And I have another handicap in that I cannot draw, so I cannot draft applique patterns. I can draft about any size of a piece pattern, but I cannot draw a small applique pattern. So you won't see much of that either. Even though that there are many examples of center focus quilts that are in crazy and applique styles. So let's begin. This talk is not really meant as a history of quilt making, but just I want to represent various quilt styles, and history gets involved. So, as far as we know, of course, the earliest quilts were whole cloth, silk, and later cotton quilts. This is the one that I did not make. It's actually a 1920s or 30s baby quilt, but the bright yellow color is one that you see often, or relatively often, in early 17th, 18th century whole cloth quilts. So we've got the medallion in the center, surrounded by the feather circle, cross hatching, and then the outer border of scallops with the edge. But this central focus was so important that it influenced, pieced and applique quilts for many years. In the 18th century, when printed fabrics were relatively rare and expensive, the central image in the American pieced framed center quilts would be a valued fabric or another piece of handwork with some sort of design. I think they were eager for pattern. This has a crewel embroidered center, and I think I did what I think that many other quilters did then, was I recycled a piece. The center, the crewel embroidered center on linen, is actually a pillow cover I made when I was a teenager. And I much later cut it out and put it in the center of this quilt.
Excuse me, could you walk it from side to side so people get a better view?
I'll move back a little bit so there's a little more room. Okay. 18th century quilts, the piecing tended to be very simple, sometimes even casual, usually just squares and triangles. Another center of the quilts would be a precious piece of fabric. This is based on a quilt supposedly made by Martha Washington in the 1790s, with a piece from a commemorative print in it. This one happens to be a print of Columbus discovering America, which came along about the time I wanted to make a quilt like this. So, and again, you see the piecing around it is simple, squares and triangles. This quilt has a pieced and applique center with, again, a very simple background. The idea of borders seems to be kind of dissolving into the simple kind of hourglass block patterns that eventually would come. Against this very geometric quilt, then the quilt maker appliqued a design that we would now call a Dresden plate variation. That came much later, but the whole idea of having all pieced, that you shouldn't mix fabrics, you shouldn't mix, pieced and applique, that idea was foreign to 18th and early 19th century quilters. And one of the other things I like about this quilt is the T-shaped borders, the borders on three sides with the cutout to go around the four-poster bed. That's always seemed to me an ingenious idea. Okay, this quilt has a printed center that was made for quilts, by the 1830s or so, when quilts of this style were made. They would use such a print. or would cut out and applique flowers and other designs. So, we've got printmaking and fabric manufacture had advanced to a point where you had this kind of possibility, at least if you were an urban, relatively affluent quilt maker who could afford coordinating fabrics, more or less. By contrast, this next quilt is very much a country quilt. I believe it was found in Kentucky, and it was probably made somewhere around the time that Kentucky was a frontier state. The fabrics in the original and in this were, cottons and linen cotton mixtures. So, and again, we have a central star, but the piecing around it, again, is casual. Notice, and this is not my fault, this is the way the original quilt was, the little isosceles triangles at the top where the border, the triangle border couldn't quite, wasn't quite the right size. And then the border of that one, the pieces, again, the casual pieces, maybe they're repairs, or maybe they just didn't have enough of a length of a fabric to get all the way down the border. So, but the quilt maker probably didn't care. Yeah, I think this is a cute quilt. These next couple quilts embody kind of the transition to repeated block quilts. This one we've got an evening star, 4-patch evening star in the center, and it's emphasized by the dark or the darker background, which in this 4-patch evening star is made into a 9-patch, and then surrounding it we've got the blue 9 patches and then the variously colored Ohio stars. But the quilt maker does not seem to have been really committed to blocks exactly, since it was perfectly fine to cut off, a third of the Ohio stars. This next one, again, it has a very different feel, and you can tell by this time, again, this is 1830s or so, the printed fabrics were much more commonly available. But here we've got the Lemoyne star in the center, and it's on the background of the only plain white fabrics in the whole quilt, and then emphasized again by a frame. But then the rest of it is 4 patches, double 4 patches, which is small 4 patches alternating with the larger ones, and then 16 patches. But we can tell that these were made as 4 patches. They're not just a border or borders going around that center square, because almost always at least 2 of the patches in the 4 patches are matching. And then to top it off, there's a 2 triangle borders. Sorry. So we have 3 sizes of squares, and then the triangle borders that at least match up, the corners match up with the size of the square. Again, it's so densely patterned that it's a little hard to see. But block style, repeating block style quilts became the norm in between the 30s and for most of the centuries, But when the Civil War came along, that patriotic impulse, brought about a revival of the center style. This design was published in a magazine, and there's a number of examples that survive. The blue field with stars, and the background of stripes, obviously, is meant to represent the flag, but the stars and the blue field are not in the corner. But instead we have stars around on the blue border on the outside, which, at least in some versions, it said that they represent the loyal states. The center focus style came back again for the centennial of the United States. And by this time, fabric makers were printing special patriotic fabrics, like this eagle, and coordinating fabrics. There's all kinds of flags and little things in the smaller prints. This style of quilt would have been familiar to the quilt makers because their grandparents probably had these quilts still on their beds. However, that style doesn't seem to have outlived the centennial. It wasn't really until the next Great War that a straight out center and border quilt came along. But quilters did other interesting things. This next quilt is a repeat block quilt, but what the quilter has done by her arrangement of blocks is she's created this red center with the red pieced circles around it, and then border with half and quarter, and these are all fan blocks. And then on the outside, I just love how the half block, how she turns the corner, with the 3/4 block. So this would be from about the 1880s or so, when show quilts, silk show quilts were in style. And it's embroidered, it's affiliated with the crazy quilt style, but not quite the same. And of course, you can do this more easily with asymmetrical blocks, and you can also do it with log cabin blocks. And I'm sure you all know, the barn raising design, where you have a focus in the center because there's a center square. So here we have, the black stepped square inside the blue square, and then the quilt maker alternated with the yellow diagonal blocks with the yellow diagonal that outlines it. So, very simple blocks in a way, but all kinds of interesting things are going on. So I mentioned that the wars brings out the center quilt block and style. And this is a pattern that was printed in a magazine, The Modern Priscilla, in about 1918 as we were entering World War I. This combines a number of things. It combines the red and white quilts, which I hope you've all seen upstairs. It combines the signature quilt, where you paid 10 cents or whatever to have your signature embroidered on the quilt, as well as the center quilt style. What I did in this quilt, Lauren mentioned that I'm editor of the Willa Cather Scholarly Edition, and so since this is a World War I quilt, the names on it are characters in Willa Cather's novel One of Ours, which is the story of World War I, or well, it's actually the story of her cousin who was killed in World War I, and his name is on the big block in the center. And I should mention he was based on Cather's own cousin, who lived out in Webster County with him. And then we jump ahead to the 30s. This is an Ann Orr design, and she was first an embroidery designer, and then a quilt designer, and she combined these into her petty point quilts. And of course, Nebraska's own Grace Snyder brought the petty point style to, as far as it can possibly go, as far as I know. But this basket quilt, or basket design of Ann Orr's, was a popular one. And one of the things I like about it is the way the blue border gives the effect of being kind of shaped and kind of overlaying, say, a white bed skirt. And I think it's also interesting the way she has a design to go across, separate design to go across the pillow top. Some of you will remember back, what was it, the 1980s or so, when it was suggested that we make a pillow tuck in our quilts, have a plain area that could be tucked under the pillows so that the design would not be interrupted. And she was emphasizing the bend. Okay. And then we jump again because the center focus quilt just kind of disappeared until Jenny Beyer came along, basically. And she revolutionized the way we looked at quilts and the way we organized quilts. And then when she developed lines of coordinating fabrics, then we learned really different ways of doing things. And particularly, at least I don't remember paying very much attention to corners when I first started making quilts. And the Jenny Beyer style emphasized, really smoothly turning the corner. So I don't know if you can see the blue medallions in the corner. You didn't want to just have the appearance of anything cut off. Just made it look as though it were printed, really. Okay, I'm going to go back a little bit. Actually, let's see, can you? Another way of emphasizing the center is to make it look as though there's nothing there, except that you're really showcasing something special in the middle. This is an example of a petticoat quilt. The original, or most commonly in the 18th century, you had quilted petticoats that showed over an open front gown. And when that style went out, then some quilt makers unpicked the seams and they took the decorative part and they made it as the center of the quilt. So if you turn it around, you can see that how the separate section was from the petticoat in the center, and then you quilted around it. The other thing I thought was interesting about this was the use of the Ohio stars in the corner. Again, I'm not sure exactly when this was made, but it must have been when blocks were reappearing as design elements. As cotton prints became increasingly affordable, it seems to me that having a big swath of a cotton print showed that you could afford a lot of fabric. So this one just has a very plain border, but the back is also interesting in it too. It's a copperplate print, and copperplate prints were engraved so that a lot of detail was possible. And when I read the volume about the Winterthur Museum, Henry DuPont, who collected antique quilts to go with his genuine antique beds, would sometimes turn a quilt over and to show it as a whole cloth quilt for really choice fabrics like this. So I suppose it's possible that this was made with the copper print as the top surface, and she just didn't have enough of the other print and needed the border. But one way or the other, she was showing off fabric. And we all know how quilters love fabric. Now, the copperplate prints seem to have been a frequent choice as a special quilt. Here, one version is in blue, and then with the zigzag border, which you can see is two borders offset to make the zigzag. And you also see the strip across the top, which you see in a number of older quilts where apparently it was tucked over the pillows and wouldn't show, so you didn't need to do the same design all the way across the top. And even a small piece of copper plate. This is a child's quilt with a little piece of copper plate in the center. And again, very casual piecing, the squares and the triangles that don't match up. But I still liked it. And now I'm going to jump ahead almost 100 years to this quilt with an open center. This is Marie Webster's design. Doesn't really matter what's on top, but published in her 1915 history of quilts. And the first, or the really early example of what we call sunbonnet suit now, sunbonnet ladies. But the center is very densely quilted, and it's really hard to tell, but the ladies who aren't holding umbrellas are holding big stemmed flowers, so there are flowers in that central field. And they're standing against a picket fence. It's quilted. And then the 7 borders kind of interweave at the corners, which is another feature I really liked. I'm not fond of sunbonnet suit, but I liked that one. Another way to get attention to the center is have an explosion in the center. So, blazing star quilts like this, you can't help but see the center and see how things are radiating out all around. This is an early example with applique pieces and a pieced border and then a plain border. But really, you don't really need, this, let me show this.
With a blazing star, you don't even need the points or anything else. It just explodes.
Explodes and it, grabs your attention. And another way to focus on the center is to really change out your design completely. This strip quilt, again another show quilt, changes in the center. It's rail fence, and it changes into a crazy quilt, and the crazy quilt strip in the center. Complete with embroidery. But I liked the way it zigzagged. And then go back again. I think I must have gotten this.
This is the top. No.
Orientation is important. Other way, now it's upside down. Okay. The center is very subtle in this, but if you look, you can see that it's centered by a red and green forepatch. The other red and green squares and triangles are out at the edges, and the blue and white are distributed symmetrically around the top. So this is another way to do it, just by your distribution of color. And the other thing I liked about this quilt, again, was the U shape, and to keep the corner from dragging on the floor. And you didn't need to pay attention to the top. You don't need to have a border on all 4 sides, which is freeing when you're quilting an elaborate border, too. Oh, that's the bottom, I guess. Okay. And here's another, very dramatic example. Just by choosing your colors, you've got a very dramatic center, and then the much more subdued colors and the dark colors. This is actually a wool quilt. And it's a fairly early quilt. And you can tell that partly by, notice the little cutouts at the bottom. This is a quilt meant to go on a low bed rather than the high beds that requires the long, big wide borders. And so it's cut out just a little bit. But hexagons and 60-degree diamonds are not nearly as easy to draft as squares and triangles, but they still show up in the 18th century. Maybe it's from the influence of British quilts. Now, the first quilt pattern, as I'm sure you know, published in America was when Godey's Ladies book, published just an outline design of a ring of hexagons with one in the center. So this became popular 1830s. It becomes, you can call it an all-over quilt, you can call it a block design, a repeated block, but notice how the center is emphasized by having the triangles with a darker background than the rest of the quilt, and then surrounded by, dark red hexagons that match. Well, whereas the others are all pretty much varied. This quilt is a hexagon charm quilt that's based on the quilt that Lois Wilson's grandmother made. And I really like how that pink hexagon, that one pink hexagon in the center, really organizes it, and so then you can see the dark and the medium and the light circles of hexagons bordering it, and going around and around. No, I made this based on Lois's quilt. Oh. You're lucky. Yeah. So, and finally, I'm just going to show you this quilt, which is a variation of the Trip Around the World quilt. It's obviously from the 1920s or 1930s. But you have the deeper pink in the center, bordered by all the different colors, some of which blend and some of which contrast, giving you a lot of variety in a quilt that's made from just one size of square. But it is easier to make than a hexagon quilt, because you could at least organize the squares in long rows, even if they're kind of diagonal. I certainly hope that no quilter ever set in every single square in a quilt like that. So those are the quilts that I brought to show you. As you know, after the 30s, what was World War II, quilting, material shortages, quilting became unfashionable, it just kind of languished. But the older generation kept alive the techniques, and patterns were still published. I can remember my mother would clip patterns from the classified ads for Laura Wheeler quilts and things like that. Some new designs, some old ones. She never got around to making most of those, but they were there, and the techniques were there, and when quilting revived in the 1960s and 70s, the older generation was there to show us how to do it. So we learned how to look at quilts in many different ways. We saw the many varieties of ways to put quilts together. And so even if we can't draw, like me, we can still draw inspiration and make, I hope, beautiful quilts. Thank you very much for being here. And if you have any questions, I would be happy to try to answer them.
So you made all of these quilts from patterns that you saw before?
Mostly from books. The question was, did I make all these from patterns I saw from other people? I saw a picture, and I would draft it and make it look for fabrics. I also collect antique costume. I do not cut up old clothes or antique clothing to make quilts. So, and especially in the early days, that was part of the fun, was hunting down appropriate looking fabrics. I did a lot of looking around thrift shops in the early days to find small prints. Because when I started quilting, that was the golden age of polyester and psychedelic prints. Did not fit. Yes,
Your quilting is really beautiful. Just magnificent.
oh. Well, thank you. It's not fine. I mean, if you counted stitches, then you wouldn't. But go ahead.
What kind of batting do you use? They also look like they hang so nicely, and
is a thin cotton batting, sometimes warm and natural. I thought that was all cotton for a long time, and I don't think it is, or isn't anymore. But yeah, I try to use what's appropriate. I have a few examples of quilts from, that I've made from the 1960s that I've used polyester batting, but I try to use appropriate techniques. Like I hand piece when machines would not have been available to the quilter. Try to keep it. It gives you the feel of how much work went into things. Yes.
Your fabrics fit so beautifully.
Well, thank you.
Are some of them vintage fabrics and some reproductions, or?
Question is, are some of the fabrics vintage or reproductions? Some are older, like in that charm quilt. I think I can point to a thrift store dress that I bought. It had a small enough print that I felt I could use it. And when I first started, there really weren't so many reproduction, fabrics available as there are now. So, I just had to hunt for what looked right. That's what looking at a lot of pictures does. And of course, looking at actual quilts. The quilt museum wasn't around then when I started making these. Any other questions? Yes?
How long does it take you to make one on average?
Well, in my heyday, and when my kids were all in school, and I was working part-time and had, 1.5 days a week that, I was free, I tried to make one a month. I would have one being pieced and another one being quilted and looking around for the next quilt. I didn't always make that, but I could probably do 10 a year, something like that. It wasn't long enough to get sick and tired of them. It's really just been a really fun project. It really honed my history skills, my fabric skills, my sewing skills, even though I still don't quilt with a thimble. Thank you very much.